So let's start with voter fraud versus election fraud. So we just had an election in the United States in November, and a lot of people were talking about like voter fraud and election fraud, and what does it all mean, right? So if you don't know, voter fraud is an attempt to is a committing of an illegal act related to a single voter and the casting of votes. So in other words, if I went to my home county and I tried to vote, and then I went to another county and I tried to vote, that's voter fraud, right? That is the act of a single individual attempting to influence an election in a way with their vote that is illegal. Now, election fraud is a completely different thing and isn't talked about nearly enough. Election fraud is essentially anything that the powers that be do to change the course of an election, to change who can vote in an election, and to change who can win an election. So the most common types of of election fraud in United States elections is typically things like voter purges, the way ballots are structured, and things like that. So the difference between the two is just really size and scale. And the thing that I think is important to point out here is that in the United States, there are almost no, like statistically, there are almost no cases of voter fraud. There was a study done, I forget by which institution, but essentially they found like 12 cases out of 1 billion votes. And I can't do the math on that, but it's very, very tiny, essentially. And by the way, typically, the thing that's interesting about voter fraud is that typically when people do voter fraud, they get caught. Like the reason that we know that voter fraud happens sometimes, albeit very rarely, is because people get caught. You know, it's not difficult to catch people trying to vote twice or vote for someone who isn't alive or cast a vote for their dog or whatever. Whatever the ridiculous thing they're trying to do is, but people get caught. And that really is kind of the biggest difference between election fraud and voter fraud is that people trying to commit voter fraud, individuals trying to commit voter fraud almost always get caught and are punished. Whereas election fraud happens all the time in the United States. The election fraud is so bad in the United States that in 1965 we had to pass the Voting Rights Act, which had whole swaths of states that weren't allowed to change their ballot policy or voting policies without permission from the federal government, because it was just that bad. Many of you know that recently, in the last couple of years, I think it was, the VRA was essentially gutted, especially Title V, which was that title having to do specifically with states that could change their election laws or election practices before elections. The argument from the court was that the formula was wrong. And of course, within hours of that decision coming down, the states that the Supreme Court argued had learned their lesson immediately put in voting restrictions. So obviously, we need more protection from election fraud.